what we're going to look at, and this has become extremely important in conversations with regards to foreign ownership of U.S. food and agricultural assets. In terms of looking at this, we're going to spend a little bit of time just looking at food and agricultural company investment, and then we're going to focus on agricultural land ownership. In some respects, I think probably the ownership of food and agricultural company investment may be more important than agricultural land ownership. Certainly the agricultural land ownership has gotten some play, especially with some of the discussion in North Dakota with regards to the purchase of agricultural land out there. But we're going to start off with regards to the food and agricultural company investment. There's a couple of good resources that essentially are out there, and I will be kind of using their information. The first one looks at Chinese companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges. This is a quarterly report that is presented every 3 months. The data that I have is from January 9th, 2023. That is the most recent one. Obviously, given that 3 quarters are almost up, we should see something coming out pretty quickly that will kind of give the situation in April. And if you're interested in following just kind of what's going on from a broad macro perspective, this is a great resource that is up there on a quarterly basis. But to give you an indication, as of January 9th, 2023, there were 252 companies, Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, or the American. This actually was down with regards to the companies from September 30th. And so September 30th, there were 262. And as of January 9th, there's 2023. The market capitalization, while that the number of companies went down, the capitalization went up. And so the market value of equity as of January 9th, 2023 was $1 trillion. Essentially, it went up roughly $250 billion from September 2022, where it was $776 billion. And so certainly that has changed over that period of time. And September, 2 companies have listed, 6 were delisted. And then there were other companies, in order to get that net negative 10, were removed simply because the companies made disinvestments within China. And so what's nice about this publication is it actually has each of the companies listed. It has their market value and a little bit more information about this. A couple things that are extremely important, and in September, this was going to be possibly a big issue, that there was the potential of 164 Chinese companies that could be delisted. And at that time, it was about 762 billion combined market capitalization. And so if you kind of look at the market capitalization of the total companies of about 778 on the previous slide and the 762, basically that would have been a major aspect. The issue there and why those were potentially going to be delisted was the ability to get unfettered inspection of Chinese and Hong Kong auditors such that they could verify essentially the accuracy of that information. That essentially was resolved in December 15th, where those companies did allow access to the auditors such that they could get a better idea with regards to the accuracy of those financial statements. And again, obviously, the U.S. financial statement is very important to have accurate numbers. And the concern with the Chinese companies was just how accurate those numbers were. And so while there was this crisis averted in December, this could snap back if this is prevented in the future. And so the legislation basically indicated that there was an initial date, but the legislation also indicates that this could snap back if prevented in the future. And so what that means is that if at any point a set of companies or a company or all companies, the Chinese government did not allow those access to the auditors to understand how those financial statements are put together, they could be immediately delisted. The other thing going on there, and this is also pretty important, is that they use a variable interest structure. And there's 161 companies that use this to sell shares. And this contains 910 billion combined market capitalization. And so when you look at $1 trillion in 900 billion, essentially there's 100 billion that isn't subject to this. The issue is just clearly what the legal status is in China. There's some concern, and this is detailed more in the report if you have an interest in learning about this. But there's some concern with regards to actions that could be taken that would essentially say this is no longer legal in China. And so there certainly is risk there associated with companies that use this VIE structure with regards to that. And so that's another thing I think to think about, especially as you're looking at Chinese companies. The third aspect there certainly is the national security risk, and a quote from the publication is that investors in Chinese companies may support activities that are contrary to U.S. national investments, including the development of technology used for censorship, surveillance, and the support of the military. Certainly, Weibo has been in the news. Essentially, this is a $4.7 billion company. Right now, there's a lot of discussion with regards to TikTok. But of the 252, none of these are traded in food and agriculture. The types of companies listed there tend to be healthcare, tend to be technology companies, and then some mining companies and raw material type companies. And so while there are 252 companies, Chinese companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges, none of them are kind of in the food and agriculture space. However, in terms of looking at the food and agricultural space, certainly there's some interesting things going on there, especially when you look at the China situation. In terms of, this is a table from this publication, and essentially this is another publication if you're interested in that I would encourage you to take a look at. Very in-depth publication. It was published in May of 2022, and so it's relatively interest, but it goes in very detailed aspects with regards to China's interests in U.S. agriculture. And so looking at this, it gives a little bit of an indication of the top 10 U.S. ag exports to China, both in 2016 and 2021. You can see that soybeans was top both in 2016 and 2021. Certainly grain sorghum in 2016 was there as number 2, number 3 in 2021. And so you can basically just go down with regards to how those exports have changed over time. And again, if you want updated information on this, essentially you can use the website there, usatrade.census.gov to kind of look at that. Then you look at the imports into the U.S. One of the things you'll notice is our exports are a lot bigger than our imports. And so the types of things we're importing are prepared preserved fruit, nuts, fruits, fruit, nuts, vegetable juices. And again, you can see how that changes a little bit, but this is, I think, kind of a nice analysis in terms of, from an agricultural perspective, what we're exporting to China and what we're importing to China. In terms of China is pretty concerned with regards to their food security. And one of the things that is beginning to incur in China is changing population trends, but lack of arable land is a big concern within China. To give you an indication, China has 294 million arable acres with a population of 1.4 billion. From a contrast perspective, the U.S. has about 375 million acres with a population of 330. And so you can see basically the arable acres supporting the population is radically different and much more concentrated in China than it is in the U.S. And so certainly feeding that many people with a smaller land base than we have in the U.S. Certainly creates concerns on the part of the Chinese government. The other thing that's occurring is just shifting migration, consumption, and population dynamics. One of the things that's beginning to occur is declining birth rates. If you look at China's population projections into the future, you will see less people in the country in 10, 15, 20, 25 years than there are currently. And so China is going to begin to slowly depopulate. It's not anything fast by any means, but certainly in terms of as those birth rates begin to slow, it will have implications with regards to people of working age and just how they can support the Chinese economy. Also, there's been a lot of migration to cities. Similar types of things have occurred in the U.S., but certainly that migration to cities will strain farms for labor. And so less children being born, more migration to cities are basically straining the farms, the labor in order to produce the crops within China. Also, there's a shifting demand for more protein and higher cut meat. This has tripled over the last 40 years. The big issue here is as China becomes more wealthy, there is more demand for protein and higher cut meat. And certainly this has implications with regards to that. Combined within this is under the Trump administration, basically China, because of livestock diseases, decided to move their hog production from a backyard type system, open system, to more of a confined system. They also have moved to feed their swine population a vegetable diet. And so certainly as the demand for hog production and protein increases in China, with the combined shift into the diets that the hog population will eat is really creating challenges for the ability of China to produce its own food. And in some respects, I think that's why we're seeing more corn being imported into China, the shifting diets with regards to that. The other major challenge facing China's food security are livestock diseases, pets, pollution, natural disasters. I think we're all familiar with African swine fever, but there's also, for example, farm armyworm has been pretty tough on some of the crops within China. Water and soil pollution are major issues, and then you have flooding issues from place to place. And all of these create challenges with regards to this. And these three aspects, and they're very broad, prevents challenges with regards to China's food security. And so that presents them with two main options. One is to purchase land abroad. The other is to work to improve domestic land. And in some respects, China has chosen to do both, realizing that they do need to look at this. And so they are certainly interested in purchasing land abroad, not only in the U.S., but also in other countries. Africa is one of the major realms where there's a lot of Chinese investment in order to get access to land. But they're also working to improve domestic land. They do have policies to seek more self-sufficiency than they currently have. They do have an interest in reducing import reliance. They do have interest in improving their domestic farmland, but they also have an interest in advancing innovation. And so essentially they want more agricultural technology to essentially innovate their agriculture. Within this document, there's a graph that indicates that China would require more than 200 million hectares to feed its population with no inputs. And so essentially, they would need a total of 200 million hectares. You multiply that by 2.5 to get acres. And so they would need 500 million acres to feed its population. And the previous number indicates that they're well below that 500 million acres. The available cropland in 2013 was 160 million hectares. The estimate in 2021 was that had dropped to 117 million hectares. And so instead of increasing available cropland, it's actually went the other way over the 8 years. To give an indication of the importance of corn export or imports into China, in 2021, 10% of Chinese corn consumption was imported. If you look at it from a soybean perspective, in 2020, it was 85%. And so looking at that, you can really see the importance of imports into solving Chinese consumption demands. By 2025, it's estimated that the grain shortfall of 130 million metric tons within China. Because of that, the government has come up with a policy of going global to access those food and agricultural resources. And essentially part of that is encouraging Chinese conglomerates to obtain greater supply or greater control over food supply chains. And certainly we've seen a little bit of this with regards to what's happening in the US. Some of the concerns about this is that domestic efforts alone are likely not to solve China's problems. And so for them to deal with this, essentially, they're not going to be able to solve this internally. And so they're interested in investment in acquisition of farmland, animal husbandry, basically better genetics, agricultural equipment, intellectual property, GM seeds. And the U.S. is recognized as a global leader in each of these areas. Some of the concerns of this is certainly this redistributes environmental effects in terms of there is concern in terms of if they are using U.S. assets or African assets in terms of what is the incentive for those to maintain the environment. Is there aspects with regards to not being as environmentally conscious as they would be if it was land within China, and certainly that's an open question. The other thing is, and this is becoming more of an issue, is leverage over U.S. supply chains. And as we go through some of their acquisitions and that within the U.S., I think we can see kind of what some of those problems may end up being. There's also a concern with regards to U.S. competitiveness in terms of will the U.S. maintain its global standing as being the leader in agricultural investment, or if there's more Chinese investment in there, is that going to be problematic? The last thing is certainly this can jumpstart GM competition in China. And so looking at GMOs and genetically modified aspects, can that be there? And there's also concern with regards to just the amount of seed technology that has Chinese ownership involved in it. To begin looking at some of these acquisitions, in terms of, we have kind of the dates of where they are and where it is, what industries they are, and some of the things that have went on. In terms of Smithfield Foods, in 2013 was acquired by China. In 2015, there was Lansing Trade Group, which is based out of Kansas City. That was had a 20% share worth $128 million. The Smithfield was pork packing. That was a $4.7 billion transaction. Essentially, they came in and offered Smithfield's investors 31% above market prices. And so they ended up paying a premium for Smithfield's assets. In 2017, there were a couple of them. One is Syngenta. Again, this is the largest producer of agricultural chemicals, third in the largest producer of seeds. This was a $43 billion transaction. In terms of with this, though, they acquired 16 farm sites within the U.S. They also acquired 10% of U.S. corn sales and 6% of U.S. soybean sales. And so, again, the amount of assets is pretty important, and just the size of the market that is controlled. Growmart was also acquired in 2017, and this is a grain logistics company. In terms of this first investment, talking a little bit more about this, is one of the things that's recently been in the news, and in some respects, it was stopped locally, realistically. But what this was this Fufeng Group acquired North Dakota site as a location for a new wet mill in milling. They purchased 370 acres in Grand Forks Agribusiness Park. The big issue is certainly the concern with regards to some of these investment groups with regards to what their ties are to the Chinese government, and whether or not they are operating independently. The concern with this group certainly was that there were ties to the Chinese government. The mill property was located 12 miles from the Grand Forks Air Force Base, and that houses top intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. The Smithfield, in terms of looking at this one a little bit more in detail, 4.7 billion in equity, or 7.1 billion total, including the debt. Again, they gained 146,000 of U.S. agriculture farmland in the acquisition. They ended up with hog farms, processing plants, and feed mills. The big thing is they did end up with advanced hog genetics. They obtained a lot of information with regards to food safety and a lot of intellectual property in terms of how the U.S. does food safety. It also has issues with regards to the rock-free pork. But essentially, Smithfield provided China with a record amount of pork in 2020, with its own hog farms recovering from African swine fever. And so certainly a significant share of Smithfield pork was moved into China. In terms of some of the ramifications from a negative perspective, is many of Smithfield's U.S. suppliers and service suppliers saw contracts end. And so CHS, that used to do quite a bit of business with Smithfield, their contracts ended in 2014. Max Yield, another company that did a lot of business within or with Smithfield, they saw those contracts end. And so the big concern, in addition to the immediate acquisition, is some of the spillover effects with regards to will contracts change with regards to other companies and have a negative impact with regards to the rural economy, with regards to where inputs are sourced and how those occur. The next one we'll talk a little bit about is the Growmark partnership. Again, COFCO is a state-owned food processing company that acquired Growmark. Again, this provides the Chinese with joint ownership of Growmark's Mississippi barge, truck, and rail terminals in Illinois, and key areas for exporting grain. And so the thought is that will that grain be open for open market transitions, or will it be determined that there's one destination? And so certainly those are some things that people worry about. In terms of talking about risks of acquisition, certainly there are the impact on local communities. There's environmental impacts that people are concerned about. There's also just some of the economic impacts with regards to rural areas in terms of whether or not the supply chains and in the buying of products from typical U.S. companies, whether or not that will change or not. Some of the things from an economic competitiveness standpoint are looking at U.S. technology. In terms of within this report, it talks a little bit about some concerns with regards to Monsanto and Climate Corporation. The online farming software basically started appearing in China. In terms of there's some citations in that article with regards to Robert Moe and GMC from Iowa cornfields ended up being transferred to China. Some of the military concerns, and a lot of times we don't like thinking about this within the food sector, or the whole issue of biowarfare. In terms of certainly fungal spores, or just introducing disease into U.S. crops, again, with the amount of seed, U.S. seed from Syngenta being planted in the U.S., is there the possibility that unknown disease could be introduced to U.S. crops? Again, it's something we don't like thinking about in the U.S. And in that, but certainly there are military concerns with regards to putting a kill gene or an ability for crops not to reproduce normally with regards to that. Again, you hope that's not the case, but I do know that there are individuals thinking about some of those aspects. The next thing we're going to move into is agricultural land a little bit. And looking at this, there is an annual report, foreign land holdings in agriculture. In terms of the thing to realize is that the term holdings applies to all U.S. agricultural land interests held by foreign investors. This requires any interest in the land other than a security interest, that is a mortgage or debt securing. But I think it's important to realize that the data isn't perfect. And as Robin indicated, there's really no set of data that is perfect. There is some cross-listing, and hopefully we're going to be able to ferret this out for Kansas with regards to these long-term wind leases. The regulations exempt leaseholds of less than 10 years in duration. However, if it is more than 10 years, the wind energy is there, and a lot of the wind energy being put up or being entered into meet more than 10 years of duration. And so because of this, they are tied into the land. And so there is kind of an interest in terms of how much of the foreign holdings are actually bare agricultural land versus are they just the windmills, but they have to report that because of more than a 10-year duration. And so it would be nice in terms of if the data was more on a national basis, split between those, such you can see, okay, how much is wind versus how much is that, or perhaps they may end up doing kind of what they did with mineral rights. And if those were split out, they're not reported. And so it's just the agricultural industry. But I am cautioning some data because some of the numbers, especially in Kansas, you're going to see are a big change because of the wind energy industry within Kansas, and some of those are done by firms in Canada or Italy that looks at those. This is kind of the picture as of December 21st. There's two pictures here. The first one basically looks at the acres, and the second one basically looks at the percentage of land. And so these numbers were of December 31st, 2021. This publication came out at the end of December 2022. But in terms of looking at this, you see more than 500,000 acres in Kansas that is held by individuals in other countries. And if you look at it, it's kind of in that 1.6 to 2.4% of all agricultural land. You can see some of the areas around where it's less. The green is kind of in that 0.4 to 1.6 area. The orange is kind of in that 2.4% or more. And so you can certainly see differences with regards to acreage and with regards to percentage. And these numbers are updated every year. And so if you kind of want to take a look at these changes over time, it gives you an indication of just what the foreign holdings are. To look at how that's changed in the U.S. as a whole, from 2000 to 2021, the percent of privately held land went from 1.2 to 3.1%. And so over that 22-year period, essentially, we increased that amount from 2.5 or about by 1.9% with regards to that. The acres increased from 15.3 to 40 million. And so you can kind of take a look at the graph. Certainly there was a big impact kind of in the 2007, 2008 area. And then it started flattening out a little bit. And then from 2017, 18 forward, that number has become a little bit steeper with regards to that. Also, it's interesting to look at, for example, the type of foreign land held. Essentially, a lot of it is forestry. And then you have pasture, which is the yellow. The darker line is cropland. One of the things looking at cropland is that increased drastically from about 6 million acres to about 12 million acres, a doubling over the last 3 years. Other ag, not much of an increase. Pasture's been relatively flat, but you do see in terms of the cropland. And then the graph on the right there is basically just looking at a percentage of foreign ownership in terms of how that's held. Roughly, again, you can see the big holdings of forestry, but that has decreased over time, and you're seeing more cropland coming into the picture as a percentage. The next slide here basically is looking at some of these numbers over time in terms of, I've kind of from 2010 to 2020, I kind of picked some midpoint years in there. And then I have 2021 in there, so you can kind of look at what's changed over time. One of the things you'll see is the largest holder of U.S. agricultural land is Canada, then the Netherlands. But if you go all the way down to the bottom, you see China. In terms of essentially it's ranked 16th in 2021. but it went from 69,000 acres to 384,000 acres over essentially that 11-year period. And so that 11-year period, China's holdings have increased by 455% or 315,000 acres. But again, you can kind of see in terms of where the different countries rank with regards to agricultural land holdings on the U.S. as a whole. We then have this from a a Kansas perspective. The privately held ag land in Kansas is 49 million acres. Of these, 1.1 or 1.2 million acres are held by foreigners. 2.4% of this is 832,000 acres or cropland, 260 are pasture, not much forest in Kansas, and then 88,000 of others. If you look at this in terms of the top 5 are Canada, the Netherlands, Italy, the United Kingdom, and then Germany. And then all others are roughly 414,000. Through the Freedom of Information Act, and Robin and I got this information yesterday, but China owns a half an acre in Kansas. It's in Russell County, and it was acquired in 2018. But what's nice about the data that we have is I think we'll be able to do a halfway decent job of separating out wind energy from agricultural land, and certainly that's there. But within Kansas, basically, according to the December 2021 statistics that were just released, essentially Chinese ownership in Kansas is a half an acre in Russell County. With that, we're going to change to a tool, and I'm going to stop my share, and Robin's going to come on and talk about her tool. But essentially, she's been able to put together on Ag Manager a tool that will allow you to end up looking at this from other countries. And so after Robin kind of talks about her tools, I think we'll just come back and take questions. So Robin, I see your slide is up, so we'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Featherstone. And if you have questions, go ahead and type those in the chat while I'm showing this. But basically what I did was take the national report from the Farm Service Agency and put it in a map form so you can easily see by county the important information on this foreign holdings of agricultural land. So if you're on our website, you're going to go under Ag Policy, and it's right here, the foreign holdings of ag land. I do have 2010, 2020, 2021, and then the difference in those. So I'm just going to go through 2021 with you, and then you'll know how all of these work. But as you see the map, it's really best to just put it in full screen view, and then you can see the counties a lot easier. So with this, you're going to see the first number is the total amount of acres in that county that are reported as foreign held. And then the second number is what percent of the total county's ag acres that would represent. And as you hover over the county, that's where you're going to get the detail for each county. So we'll pick one, maybe a little one here that's a little smaller. But so here in Hodgeman County, we have total foreign held acres reported as 33,079. That represents 6.2% of the total ag acres in Hodgeman County. The type of foreign acres held, you can see it's broken in by acres in cropland, pasture, forest, and other ag. And then of those top 5 countries, how many acres? So here in Hodgeman County, Canada has 15,171 of those holdings. The all others, would be other countries other than those top 5 that have those foreign ag holdings. So you can see these for any county in the state. Ellsworth's the one that really sticks out like a sore thumb. We're seeing about 30% reported in that county. Again, as I saw this and talked to people in that county, the wind energy leases are really driving that. So what we hope to do in the coming weeks here is really look at the data that we obtained yesterday and be able to sort out the wind energy leases from the normal agricultural leases, because as we know, those wind turbines only cover a small footprint and the farmer is still able to farm around them. So I don't think 30% of Ellsworth County is foreign held. I think what we're seeing is the wind energy lease reported on the total amount of ground and not just the smaller footprints. With that, I think I see a question in the chat. So, oh, no, that's just Rich. If you have questions for Dr. Featherstone or I, now would be a great time to type those in the chat.
There is one from an individual, any information on what the U.S. owns in other countries? And no, I don't have that information, and I'm not sure where to get that. That's a great question, but I am not sure that that information is reported. If it was, I think it would be certainly interesting to look at. The other thing that's out there is when you get the slides, on my slides, the last slide, I have a number of sources that I've used. And so the reports that I kind of referenced are very detailed. And if you're really interested in the topic and kind of what the thought is, at least from the U.S. government perspective, just click on those links. The Ag report, again, was done in May. The ownership of our companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges, that is updated quarterly. And so you can continue to follow that if that's something you have an interest in. And then I also have the link to where you can get the U.S. report on an annual basis. And so if you want to go back and look at changes over time in the U.S., you can click on that link and get the 2021 report or the 2015 report, whatever you would want to do. And so we have that information aspects kind of on the last slide that you'll get. Any other questions? Again, this has gotten a lot of political play in terms of Kansas. The Kansas legislature has debated some laws with regards to ownership and changing the Kansas law. And so whether or not anything passes or not, it'll be interesting to see. But certainly the foreign ownership has come into play with regards to the political debate that's not only going on Topeka, it's going on in the U.S. Congress, and I know a number of states are looking at whether or not they want to do something within their own state, or whether or not they just want to follow the federal policy. And again, I know what has a lot of individuals concerned is just whether or not they're independent agents or whether or not they're coordinating with the government of China or other government entities with that respect. Other questions, and we can open it up to anything. And I think if you'd rather talk than type, I think Rich has the ability now for you to open up your mic.
I did open that up. So if you want to unmute just one at a time, so you're not talking over each other, and be nice. Robin, you got one there on why some counties have negative numbers. I think that was for the changes that happened.
Yeah, so those are actually counties that have decreased in foreign holdings. So Rush County would be an example here. Back in 2010, there was actually 4,018 acres reported, and now that's down to 2,342. So yeah, that's why those are negative numbers. Most of them have increased, but there are a few out there that actually have decreased in those 11 years. Good question.
On the foreign ag holdings in 2021, are there any of those high percentages that aren't in a county with a large wind farm?
Well, good question.
I just don't know where all the wind farms are. I know some of them, but
Yeah, I know we have a lot down in Southwest Kansas, Cloud and Ellsworth. These are big areas. There's definitely some coming in up in Northeast here. I'm not real good on how many in these other areas we might be seeing. So if somebody else is from those areas, you might help us out.
I think most of them are wind farms. Charlene indicated that Butler County has a wind farm, but I think that's where the information will be beneficial in that the information that we have is actually who made the investment, and just kind of scanning over it very quickly, and that a lot of them kind of have like a wind energy LLC or something like that is there. And so hopefully Josh will be able to answer your question a little bit better in terms of what percentage is wind versus what percentage is just agricultural. And again, we're going to have to make a judgment with regards to that. But obviously, if they have wind energy in their title, it makes it pretty straightforward. Whereas other things may be less clear, but it's there. So
thank you.
anybody else want to jump on and just discuss? And again, we'll be hanging here for a little while in terms of if you have questions for Robin or myself. I think Dan's still on. And so if you have questions on cash rent, he discussed that two weeks ago. And so if you have any questions on the land market, cash rental market, just feel free to talk out if you would like.
Alan, I don't know if you want to get that one, but yeah, most of wind energy companies are. So go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, in terms of the main owners of wind energy, the largest is Canada, and I think if you hover over Ellsworth, you'll see the amount of Canadian, and then there's also Italy has some of those, and so for example, if you go up to Cloud, that's more Italy, and then I don't know if you jump down to Ford. And so the main owners of wind energy are Italy and Canada, and Canada is the bigger one. So,
Alan, this is Dan, and Alan, Robin. So foreign companies own the wind farms, but yet they've subleased to local landowners, no doubt. So is there some mixture of ownership regime going on there and control?
Yeah, basically it's a lease. And so they lease the ability for those towers. The farmer still controls the land, but this is where the reporting requirements are a little bit, I think, confusing, simply because the farmers still own the land. They're just signing a lease. But the way that the reporting law is that if you have more than a 10-year lease associated with agricultural land, that has to be reported. And so a lot of the acres in Ellsworth County, for example, would be just the lease of the land for the wind turbines. The bare land would be owned obviously by the farmer. And in some respects, it probably would make sense. I'm sure the law has been around for quite a while. Wind energy wasn't a thought when that was done. And so my guess is they would have separated that out like they have mineral rights, such that it would give a clearer picture of that agricultural land from that. But in terms of, there is a question with regards to that, as landowners sign a lease and an easement agreement with the wind farms, how does that become ownership? It really isn't. It's just that long-term lease, but the law requires that has to be reported as foreign ownership. And so to me, there's fairly hefty fines that if that's not reported, associated with that. And so that's kind of where Adrian kind of has a great comment there, or question, is that again, I think people may have different opinions with regards to a long-term lease versus the actual ownership of the property. Stella has a question. How long is the standard wind lease? I don't know that. Does anybody know that?
Well, I think the terms are somewhat secretive. At least they were out in Thomas County. So I don't know that you know that unless somebody knows of generalities.
Yeah, I would just clarify that information on these foreign holdings is reported through the Farm Service Agency, not the county courthouse as well. So it's a national Farm Service Agency report is where we're getting these data.
This is Keith Van Skyke here. You got to be careful. Pretzer one time said there is no standard lease. Don't be worried about that.
Yep. I know some of the solar farms, those are 100-year leases. And so I don't know, in terms of, my guess is once you have a turbine up and once that thing's running, I don't know what the economic life would be, but I would imagine that certainly that economic life is going to play an important aspect with regards to how long those leases are.
I do believe that our lease on our wind turbines is for 50 years.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
And it was never disclosed that it was a foreign ownership when we signed the lease. It was U.S. ownership, and then it was subsequently sold once it went into operation. That was in Sumner County, Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
So, Alan, all of the data that you shared before this of increase in acres from 2011 to 2021, that is all potentially wind impacted as well. Is that accurate?
That is correct. And that's one of the things that where we did FOIA, FSA to get it. They sent us the Kansas information for 2021. We're going to go back and see if we can get some more, because I think from understanding this from a nationwide policy perspective, being somewhat able to tease out what is wind and what is agricultural land, I think people would be interested in that, simply because I assume people may have different opinions with regards to whether or not it's the agricultural land or whether or not it's the wind energy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just to look at Ellsworth here back in 2010, it was very minimal compared to 10 years later. So I would argue most of that impact is the wind energy.
There is a question. Can you speak through how outside investment impacts cropland rental rates in relation to the decreasing ratio as seen on Robin's presentation with regards to the rent to value ratio?
Yeah, I guess what I would say there is the outside investment is, impacting those cash rental rates much less than it's impacting the land values. So what I've seen is at a lot of these auctions and things, the person outside of Kansas that might be bidding on that auction isn't always the one that wins it. Sometimes or a lot of times it's still the local farmers that do win that auction. But the outside investment is bidding on that ground and driving it up more so than it might have otherwise. And then, some of them are directly purchasing that ground. So it's increasing the land value because of the outside investment. But as far as the cash rental rate component, it doesn't have near the impact at all. A lot of times there might be a tenant on that ground that is farming for the next year, and then that renegotiation might occur. So end of the day, land values are going up much more than cash rental rates with that outside investment support. And that keeps driving that ratio down.
Charlene asked a question with regards to how does solar farms owners tie into this? It would be the same type of thing, that if that solar farm was owned by an outside entity, it would be separated, or it would be required if it's a lease. Again, one of them that I'm familiar with was a 100-year lease. And so essentially any lease more than 10 years would have to be reported to the Farm Service Agency. And in that, the big thing with regards to solar farms is obviously the ability to farm the ground is much different on a wind farm than it is with a solar farm. But if those were foreign owned, and if the lease was more than 10 years, which in the second case, the answer is very much likely yes, then it would have to be reported as, and so it would show up on these. But I'm not sure who's doing a lot of the solar farms, whether or not those are domestic companies or foreign owned companies. So I assume that's a wind farm. Oh, that was a direct message to me. And then go ahead, Charlene.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say it's a solar farm, and that's why I was just curious on the land reporting side of things, how that tied in. Was it similar to the wind farms or not? This one's still very much in its infancy, but trying to gain traction.
But it is, if it is a foreign company either trying to buy or lease, they would have to report that on those 4,000 acres in the Flint Hills. And so that lease would have to be reported, simply because it's going to be more than 10 years if you're going to put a solar farm on any place. Adrian had a question there. The long-term lease, I don't think on wind farms it's going to become ownership, and the penalty being severe if it's not reported. Basically, that's what the feds kind of indicated with regards to the choice, is that it is a pretty severe. I can't remember what that amount is, Robin, if it's not reported.
No, I know in the 2021 report, if you look at the end of that, you can actually see the companies that were fined for not reporting, which I thought was interesting because I've never disclosed that before on any of the earlier reports. But I think it just goes back to, like you said, Alan, when this law was written, it was made to keep track of what was going on in the country as far as foreign ownership on ag ground, and those wind energy leases were not a thought back then.
Another question, is there a pie chart showing energy farms versus crop farms? We hope to put one together once we kind of get into the FOIA information. I can't remember when we first FOIA'd, but it always happens that it shows up a day before you do it and you can't have time to analyze it correctly. But yeah, we'll continue to look at this, and if we can put something with regards to the percentage of energy versus crop, that would be great. And we will then go back and do the map such that we can separate wind farm ownership versus which are just leases as opposed to that. Clayton indicates, and thanks Clayton, but essentially he indicates that the fine is up to 25% of the market value. So it is a pretty severe, severe fine there. Republic and Washington County have a wind farm under construction. Largest in Kansas when complete. Appreciate that. But there's a lot going on with regards to wind, and it is affecting these foreign ownership numbers drastically. And our goal is to be able to separate that such that people can understand just what's going on to the agricultural perspective and then what's going on from the wind perspective. And people may view those as different, or they may not, but providing more information is preferred over less information as people think about these issues.